our mission is to document the historic barn building traditions of Madison County and surrounding region and encourage the preservation of its barns and farmsteads. And we do that through a lot of photography. I will typically, once I've identified a barn that is of historic significance, I'll take anywhere from 80 to 120 photographs of every nook and cranny and detail of construction. And then I'll measure it in detail and do a set of architectural drawings that become part of our archive. We share our archives with Mars Hill University and their Ramsey Center archive, and also with the state of North Carolina. In addition to the drawings, I have a form, a database form. It starts out about 4 pages of just check marks. By the time I get it filled out, it usually runs about 6 to 7 pages. But this tells us every little detail about this barn and its property and the family, hopefully, if they are still in the area. And then all of this will be online and searchable for those people who are interested in this barn evolution here in Southern Appalachian region. So you could type in a particular feature. You might type in Flucured Tobacco, and it would bring up every barn that was ever used or had an association with the Flucured tobacco industry. Now this goes back about 2 centuries to the earliest property that we have worked with is this on your screen here, the Anderson Farm. This property was purchased in 1797. And for Madison County, that's very early. Being a border county with Tennessee, we were part of the frontier and were one of the last counties in Western North Carolina to be chartered out of Buncombe County, as many of the Western counties were. In this particular slide, you're seeing a big log livestock barn and then a log cabin. And through the family, we've come to learn that that log cabin used to be in a different location, but it is likely the original cabin built by James and Patty Anderson in 1797 when they purchased this land. And those deeds I was referring to were signed by John Strother, another by Joseph McDowell, who McDowell County is named after, and then a string of other land grant recipients like John Gray Blunt. Yeah, I mix him up with his brother William, who later became governor of Tennessee. But looking back at 200 years of how these barns came to evolve has been very, very gratifying. And we're so fortunate to have families like the Anderson family that had been on the same farm for that period of time. Mrs. Anderson, who still lives in the old home place, her great-grandson is the 8th generation of Andersons on that property. Now, the oldest barn that we've found is right on the edge of the French Broad River downstream from Hot Springs, which used to be known as Warm Springs. And we believe this rock foundation goes all the way back to when you've probably heard of Bishop Asbury, who was a traveling Methodist preacher who was trying to correct the sins of this new frontier region. And he would travel around on horseback usually. And we believe that this barn was, this foundation at least was there, and where he probably stabled his horse at an old inn owned by William Nielsen, Scotsman, who came there in the late 1700s. So this foundation may represent the oldest barn structure in our county. This barn looks ancient, and this is the Noah Cleveland Waldrop barn. When I first saw it, I thought, I just can't imagine how old this barn is, because it's all log, and then any parts of this barn that are not these log cribs, which became the stables for the livestock, any of the other parts are made out of boards that were hand-rived by splitting logs and continuing to split the log into thinner and thinner pieces to make boards. He also covered parts of the outside with split white oak shingles, as you can see. Let me ask you, is my cursor visible to you?
Yes.
It is, okay. So I'm working the cursor around on this gable end. These were all hand split shingles, which remind us that up until the early 20th century, all of these older buildings with their steep roofs were covered in hand split white oak shingles. You may ask where white oak, and it was because white oak has a tylose structure, a type of cell in its structure that impedes the flow of water, so that they were naturally kind of waterproofing, and they were the roof shingle of choice. But this guy actually covered parts of this barn. Because of all this hand-riven wood and the log structure and everything else, I thought this had to be one of the oldest barns in the county. Turns out it was built in the 1930s. So it was a wake-up call to me that looks can be deceptive, and that some of these building traditions that started in the very late 18th century continued up into the mid 20th century. Now, one of the other phenomena that I've come to understand of that early settlement period was that our pioneers, our white settlers, were very interdependent with the Cherokee Nation. And many historians have said if it weren't for the Cherokee, the white settlement would not have been successful. And the thing that they gave us in particular for our early farmers, who were predominantly Scots-Irish and were not familiar with farming this kind of land, even though many of them came from the highlands, were what became known as the Three Sisters. And that was the squash, including these two types of squash. One is a candy roaster pumpkin, and this one down here is the cushaw. And then, of course, the corn or maize, that was a staple food for making meal and cornbread types of foods. And then, of course, any of you from Haywood County are familiar with the greasy beans. I found out just a few years ago that they are officially known as the Cherokee long greasy bean. So that's a piece of this heritage that was very solidly connected to the evolution of our Southern Appalachian farmsteads. Again, the earliest barns were for livestock and for curing hay and grain to feed livestock and to feed the family. They were often known as bank barns. With all of the hills around, it was easy to build back into the bank, the side of the hill, and that gave you easier access to the second floor or the loft level. This particular barn, the access is about the height of a wagon. So if you pulled your wagon load of hay up to this large barn door with your team of horses or mules or oxen, you could, along with other helpers, pitch hay right directly into the hayloft. And of course, down below, you had your log cribs or square rooms built of logs that served as the stalls for livestock. Now, we don't know when this particular barn was built, but it's been part of a farmstead that's been in this family, again, for about 200 years. And again, these older barns started out with this steep roof, would have been covered in split white oak shingles, roofing shingles. But after a while, when metal roofing became available, it was recovered in what we know as a tin roof or a metal barn roof. Now, keep in mind the first 100 years of settlement, white settlement in Western North Carolina, had no tobacco except what was grown by each family for their own personal use. It was mostly a Virginia type of tobacco that had been traded up and down the colonies. But after the Civil War, the mountain economy was devastated. Family farms were barely hanging on, if at all. And the men had come back, the soldiers had come back, many of them wounded and disabled. Many of them had been killed. And during the Civil War, President Lincoln had created the Department of Agriculture. And by 1870, created a stimulus program. And we've all heard of stimulus programs that get kicked in after economic calamity. And this stimulus program was to introduce and support the production of the first commercial crop in the Southern Appalachians, in particular Western North Carolina, and it was flue-cured tobacco. Now, most of you have probably heard of flue-cured tobacco as opposed to burley tobacco. And this is what I worked in down in Eastern North Carolina, probably with some of Rick's cousins down there. And it has to be heat cured. And so they built this type of barn. It was a square log barn. When you see the logs continuing up into the gable end, you know that that is of the older style, one of the older barns. And then you have these round pole purlins supporting the roof, running horizontally. And this is a very rare type of barn because most of them are very old. Some of them go back to 1870 when this commercial tobacco program began. Many old timers will argue with me and say, no, we never had flue-cured tobacco here in the mountains. It was always burley. But there's tremendous evidence that flue-cured tobacco was not only popular, it was Madison County itself led the state in the production of flue-cured tobacco before Eastern North Carolina did. In 1895, Madison County produced 2.5 million pounds of flue-cured tobacco. And so for a mountain county, that was quite a bit. So this barn is a good example of that square log flue-cured barn. They would have had a small door with a rock furnace with the fire fed from the outside, and they would heat cure the tobacco leaves in about a week's time. Very much different from how burley tobacco was cured. Now later, the flue-cured market was unstable pretty much throughout its history here. But you see this log cabin on the left here. When this log cabin, again, the James and Patty Anderson cabin, no longer of use, they moved it to this site and they converted it to a flue-cured tobacco barn. And I realize this because you see these, the ends of these poles coming out through the logs. The spacing on those is about 2 feet apart. And I knew that had to be for flue-cured tobacco because with it, you only hang bunches of leaves as opposed to the entire stem as you would with burley tobacco. So again, a lot of the earlier log cabins were later used and often moved, relocated, and used for curing tobacco. Now, burley tobacco, when it first came in the late 19 teens, they cut the entire stalk and hung these stalks of tobacco. You've probably seen them out in the field after they've been cut, standing up on a tobacco stick, waiting for some of them to dry out somewhat. This is the loft of a classic livestock barn, and this loft would have been full of hay right to the very roof. But when burley tobacco came into popularity, they would convert these hay lofts for the hanging of burley tobacco. And so they would build in these vertical posts and all of these horizontal poles called tier poles for the hanging of burley tobacco, which was air cured. They didn't have to build a fire. They didn't have to heat it. It hung in the barn, and these hay lofts, which as you see here, were often covered in an open lattice work, were perfect for air curing burley tobacco because they allowed a lot of airflow. About the 1930s, you began to transition from using of existing old Flucured barns and the haylofts of livestock barns to a new type of barn. This looks like one of the old log Flucured barns. Again, you see the logs continuing up into the gable end here. This barn is made of exactly 100 logs. It was built by John Daniel Shelton and his daughter-in-law. Now, one of the interesting things I've come across is that farmers and farm families all pitched in, and several of the barns I've documented, some of the women were as much involved in the construction of the barn as the men. So his daughter-in-law, Pearl Massey, helped him build this. And to get started, they had to harvest these trees about 2 miles away over in Doe Branch, haul them by oxen team to this site. And if you've ever tried to find a straight tree, you can appreciate how difficult it would be to find 100 straight trees of the right dimensions for a barn like this. This became a transition from Flucured tobacco curing to burley tobacco curing, and later they actually put some livestock stalls down on the ground floor. Now, one of the things I began to be curious about, I'm seeing these barns and I'm fascinated by not only the craftsmanship that went into them, but just the mass of material that go into these barns. Now, this is my barn. It's 53 feet square. And right away, I noticed that these large sill logs or plates out on each outer edge, this south edge and over here on the north edge, were one tree. They were hewn square or rectilinear from one tree and wound up with a 53-foot long sill log. There are at least 12 other beams and plates in this barn that are the full length of the barn. And to me, that's just remarkable that to go up on the ridge with your draft animals and fell these trees, they had to be very straight. You had to bring them down and hew them square or rectilinear. It was just a monumental task for a 19th century farmer. There's a lot of chestnut in this, as we have noticed over the years of our Appalachian barns. Another figure came to mind, and being an architect, I could not resist figuring out how many wood oak shingles it took to cover this massive roof. And it took over 8,800 hand split, hand trimmed, split white oak shingles just to cover the roof. So it was a monumental project. And I've had great appreciation the more I've learned about these traditional barn building skills and the craftsmanship that went into them. By the 19-teens, when burley was becoming more popular in the mountains, you began to see this new style of barn. This was introduced by Claude Wild up on Big Pine Branch, Big Pine Creek. He was a traveling peddler, or back then they called them drummers, and he came across a set of barn building plans, paper plans, for this type of barn, and he brought it back to Madison County and introduced what is known as a monitor roof barn. And it's a barn with a raised ridge section in the middle. And the benefit of that is that it creates a natural chimney effect. Cooler air comes in from below and works its way up through the tobacco that's air curing, and then out the vented roof up top. This is a monitor roof barn, and the first one was introduced in 1917. By the way, I welcome any information from any of you on the barns of Haywood County, because we'll eventually spread into surrounding counties with our documentation project, and I'm very open to learning what the other county building traditions were. Again, in the 19 teens, metal roofing became available because of the use of the new railroad, relatively new railroad, but also because some farmers were becoming more successful and had more cash to spend on things like metal roofing. It allowed this other type of barn to be built, which is called a gambrel roof barn. Its origins go back to Dutch construction. It has two different slopes on each side of the roof, and that upper slope was shallow enough to where they knew they could not put oak shingles on there because it would not shed water fast enough. But having metal roofing, they were able to begin building this gambrel roof type of barn. So this is a large barn over in Spring Creek. Now for folks, if you continue on 209, you drop over into Fines Creek and the Ferguson Valley and that whole area of Haywood. A true gambrel roof barn has no interior poles. It's basically a roof that is a shell structure made up of shallow trusses. It becomes a very rigid, self-supporting roof structure, kind of a vaulted roof structure. And back with the earlier gambrel roof barns, when you had them built back into a bank, you could literally drive your team of horses pulling a sled of hay or a wagon of hay and turn around inside the barn without the interference of vertical posts. So that was one of the advantages of this true gambrel roof structure. By the mid-1930s, Burley was doing well and farmers began to build larger and larger barns for the air curing of burley tobacco. And you find these huge old burley barns. This one was 80 feet long by 40 feet wide. They didn't know exactly how best to ventilate these early exclusive burley barns back then. And so you have some windows and some shutters and things like that. And the more burley tobacco began to be grown, the better they became at ventilating this air cure type of tobacco. This is also a good example. If you look on the middle of this front wall of this barn, you see how those boards are warped. Somebody wasn't doing their homework when they sawed those boards or felled those trees, and they got in a hurry, or for whatever reason, they probably cut the trees when they still had sap in them, or they cut them during the wrong signs of the zodiac. You remember farmers, and some still today, would do everything by the signs. And also, if you did any cutting of timber, you always did it when the sap was down in the cold months. And these boards here in the middle obviously were not cut at the right time. By World War II, and with all of our military personnel coming home, again, similar to the Civil War and World War I, many of them were disabled. The economy was in shambles for many of these Appalachian mountain farms, and they began to build a new type of burley barn that was much simpler and just had this simple shed roof, and that became the barn of preference. The first one I found was 1947, and this shed roof type barn was built right up until the end of the tobacco program in 2004. The very last type of air curing of burley tobacco was simply a rack that was built along the edge of the field, where they would hang the sticks of tobacco in between two horizontal boards or posts, and just air cured. It would have a simple roof on it. It may have been covered in metal, or it may have been covered in just black plastic. Here's another version of that last version of the burley tobacco barn around 2004. So that pretty much covers the history of this barn evolution here in Madison County. And I welcome any questions you might have about, I know this is a lot of information, but I'd love to entertain any questions you might have.